Gary woke up before the sun did. That was habit. 20 years in the army does that to a man. No matter how soft the bed or how quiet the morning, his eyes opened at the same time every day. He did not fight it anymore. He simply got up, put on his boots and started his day. He lived in a small stone house at the edge of Thornwall, a dragon settlement built into the side of a long, gray cliff. Most humans did not live this close to dragons. Gary had not planned to either. But after the war ended and there was nowhere else to go, a cheap plot of land at the edge of a dragon town was what he could afford. That was 4 years ago. Now he had a herb garden, a leaky roof he kept meaning to fix, and no company except the wind. He liked it that way. That morning he pulled on his boots, grabbed his old jacket from the hook by the door, and stepped outside to check on the garden. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth. His rosemary had come up well. The mint was spreading again where it was not supposed to. He crouched down and began pulling the extra shoots out by the root. He did not notice the hatchling at first. It was sitting beside the doorstep, very still, watching him. It was tiny. Smaller than any hatchling Gary had ever seen, and he had seen a few from a distance during his years near the settlement. Most hatchlings were the size of a large dog within weeks of hatching. This one looked like it had barely made it past the egg. It was the size of a house cat, maybe a little longer, with pale gray scales that had a faint blue tint in the early morning light. Its wings were folded flat against its back. Its eyes were a bright, steady amber. It was just looking at him. Gary looked back at it for a moment. Then he pointed toward the cliff. "Go home," he said. The hatchling did not move. Gary went back to his mint. A few minutes later he stood up and turned around to go inside for his morning tea. The hatchling had moved. It was now sitting directly behind him, about 2 feet from his boots, still watching him with those amber eyes. Gary stared at it. It stared back. "I said go home," he told it again, a little louder this time. Nothing. He waved his hand at it the way you might wave off a stray dog. The hatchling flinched slightly at the sudden movement but did not leave. It just leaned back a little and then settled again, eyes still fixed on him. Gary went inside and made his tea. When he came back out with his cup, the hatchling was sitting on his doorstep. He spent the rest of the morning trying to ignore it. He fixed a loose post on the garden fence. He carried water from the well. He sat on his wooden chair outside and read for a while. The whole time the hatchling followed him. Not fast, not loudly. Just quietly, steadily, staying a few feet behind him wherever he went, stopping when he stopped, moving when he moved. It did not make a sound. Gary tried talking to it again twice. Both times it just looked at him. He tried walking toward it once, thinking that might scare it off. The hatchling sat down and waited until he stopped walking, then blinked slowly at him. By midday Gary was irritated. By afternoon he had started to feel something else, though he could not name it exactly. Something between concern and reluctance. The hatchling had not eaten anything. It had not drunk any water that he saw. It was very small and the day was warming up, and Gary did not know much about hatchlings, but he knew that tiny things without their mothers did not do well in the heat. He put a shallow bowl of water near the garden fence. He did not look at the hatchling while he did it. A few minutes later, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it walk to the bowl, dip its head and drink. Gary looked away and said nothing. The sun went down slowly that evening, dragging the warmth with it. Gary cooked a simple meal inside, ate it at his small table, and then came outside one last time to close up the garden gate. He expected the hatchling to be gone by now. It had been a whole day. Surely it had somewhere to be. Surely someone had noticed it was missing. He stepped outside. The hatchling was sitting directly in front of the door, right where his feet would land when he stepped off the threshold. It looked up at him. In the low evening light its scales were almost silver. Gary stood there for a long moment. Then he sat down in his chair to think about what to do next. He was still thinking when he felt it. A small, careful pressure on top of his left boot. He looked down. The hatchling had climbed onto his foot, turned itself in a small circle like a dog settling for sleep, and curled into a tight ball directly across both his boots, its tail tucked around its own nose, its tiny sides rising and falling in slow, even breaths. It was asleep. Gary sat very still. The night came in around him. The stars appeared one by one above the cliff. He did not move his feet. He did not know why. He just sat there in the dark with a creature barely bigger than his 2 fists curled on top of his boots, and for the first time in 4 years, the silence did not feel quite so empty. Gary did not sleep well that night. He had eventually moved his feet carefully and gone inside. The hatchling had stirred, blinked up at him with those amber eyes, and then simply followed him through the door like it had always lived there. Gary had put an old folded blanket near the fireplace, pointed at it firmly, and gone to bed. He woke up with the hatchling on his feet again. It had climbed up onto the bed at some point in the night and settled across his ankles like a warm, scaly weight. Gary had stared at the ceiling for a while. Then he had gotten up, gotten dressed, and made a decision. He was going to find out where this thing belonged. The dragon settlement of Thornwall was not a place most humans wandered into without reason. It was not unwelcoming exactly, but it was built for creatures twice the size of a man, with wide stone paths and tall arched doorways and a general sense that the space around you was designed for something larger than you were. Gary had walked through it a handful of times over the years, usually to trade herbs at the outer market. He had never gone deep into the settlement before. He went now. The hatchling followed him. Gary had tried leaving it at the house. He had stepped outside, closed the door, walked 10 steps, and then heard a sound. A very small, very unhappy sound from inside the house. Not quite a cry. More like a question. A sound that said, "Where did you go and why?" Gary had stood there for a moment. Then he had gone back, opened the door, and looked down at the hatchling sitting right behind it. "Fine," he said. "But stay close." The hatchling stayed close. They walked together through the outer paths of Thornwall. A few dragons watched them pass. Gary kept his eyes forward. The hatchling stayed right at his heels, its small claws clicking softly on the stone path with every step. He found the elder near the center of the settlement, sitting in a wide open courtyard in the morning sun. Her name was Sarah. Gary had heard it mentioned once or twice in the outer market. She was old, much older than the other dragons he could see nearby, with deep green scales that had gone pale at the edges and eyes the color of still water. She was enormous in the way that very old things sometimes are, like she had simply kept growing long after everything else had stopped. She looked at Gary when he approached. Then she looked down at the hatchling beside his feet. Something moved in her expression. Something quiet and a little sad. Gary stopped a respectful distance away and spoke plainly. "I found this one outside my door yesterday morning," he said. "I want to return it to its family." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She lowered her great head slowly until she was closer to the hatchling's level. The hatchling looked up at her. It did not move toward her. It pressed very slightly closer to Gary's boot. Sarah straightened again and looked at Gary. "That one was born to a clutch of 11, she said. Her voice was low and slow, like stone settling. Its mother did not survive the birthing. The clutch was large and the youngest came too late. By the time it hatched, the others were already bonded and feeding." Gary waited. "No family in the settlement has claimed it," Sarah continued. "It is small. Slower than the others. It was passed over." She paused. "We have been watching it for some weeks. It would not stay where we placed it. It kept wandering toward the outer edge of the settlement." Gary looked down at the hatchling. It was sitting on his left foot now. He had not noticed it climb on. "So there is no family to return it to," Gary said. "No," Sarah said simply. Gary rubbed the back of his neck. He had not expected that. He had come here with a clear purpose and a simple plan, and now both of those things were gone and he was standing in the middle of a dragon settlement with a hatchling on his foot and no idea what came next. "What happens to it then?" he said. It was not quite a question. Sarah regarded him calmly. "That is not something I can answer for you," she said. "Or for it." She glanced down at the hatchling again. "But I will tell you something. A hatchling that has lost its mother will search. Not with its eyes. With something older than that. It searches until it finds a place that feels safe." She paused. "It appears to have found one." Gary said nothing. "I am not asking anything of you," Sarah added. "I want to be clear about that. You are free to walk away. But the choice has already been made. Not by you. Not by me." She looked at the hatchling one more time. "By it?" Gary stood there a moment longer. Then he thanked her, turned around, and started walking home. The hatchling followed. It stayed right at his heels the whole way back through the stone paths of Thornwall, out through the outer edge and down the road to his small house. Gary did not speak. He was thinking or trying to. His thoughts kept slipping away before he could finish them. He reached his door and stopped. The hatchling walked around his feet once, then sat down directly on top of his boots and looked up at him. Gary looked down at it for a long moment. Its amber eyes were steady and calm and completely certain in a way that Gary had not felt about anything in a very long time. He opened the door. "Wipe your feet," he said. He went inside. The hatchling followed. Gary told himself it would be a few days at most. He said this on the first morning, when he woke up and found the hatchling asleep across his ankles again. He said it while he made his tea and watched the tiny creature follow him from the bedroom to the kitchen without being asked. He said it quietly to nobody in particular, while he ate his breakfast and felt a small scaly chin rest itself on top of his left foot. A few days. That was all. Then he would figure something out. A week passed. The hatchling was still there. Gary gave it a name on the 4th day. He had not meant to. Names made things permanent and he was not ready for permanent. But on the 4th morning he had stepped outside to check the garden and looked back to find the tiny creature hopping carefully over the doorstep with enormous concentration, its little wings half open for balance, its tongue flicking at the morning air. Something about it made Gary's chest do a thing he did not expect. "Pip," he said without thinking. The hatchling looked up at him. "That is your name now," Gary told it. "Do not make it a big thing." Pip blinked. Then it walked over and sat on his foot. Gary sighed and went to tend the rosemary. He built a sleeping spot on the 6th day. He was not proud of how much thought he put into it. He found a wide wooden crate in the back shed and lined it with an old wool blanket, folded twice for softness. He placed it near the fireplace where it would stay warm through the night. He even angled it slightly toward the room so Pip would be able to see the door and not feel closed in. He set Pip down in it gently that evening and stood back. Pip looked at the crate. Then at Gary. Then at the crate again. Then it climbed out, walked across the room and settled on Gary's feet. Gary stared at the empty crate for a moment. He moved the crate closer to his chair. Pip ignored it. He put one of his worn socks inside it because he had read somewhere that familiar smells helped young animals feel safe. Pip sniffed the sock once and walked away. He tried placing Pip inside it again 3 more times over the following 2 days. On the 3rd try Pip climbed out before Gary had even straightened up. Gary pushed the crate into the corner and left it there. It became a place where he kept spare gardening gloves. The days settled into a new shape. Gary's old routine had been simple and quiet and entirely his own. It was still simple and quiet. It was no longer entirely his own. He could not move through the house at his usual pace anymore because Pip was always underfoot and he had to watch where he stepped. He had to watch where he sat too because Pip had a habit of sleeping in the shadow of things and the shadow of Gary's chair was a favorite spot. Twice he nearly sat on Pip without seeing it. After the 2nd time he started checking the chair before he sat down, every single time without fail. He adjusted the way he walked in the garden. Shorter steps. More careful turns. He started announcing himself when he came around corners, which he realized after a few days meant he was narrating his own movements to a dragon the size of a loaf of bread. Coming around the bean posts, he would say. Pip would appear from wherever it had been and fall into step behind him. Gary stopped commenting on how strange this was after the 1st week. It simply became what he did. He started cooking a little extra at mealtimes. Not much. Just a small portion of whatever soft food he thought Pip might manage. Pip turned out to like cooked fish very much and have strong opinions against anything green. Gary noted this without admitting he was noting it. Word spread through Thornwall the way word always spreads in small places. Quietly and to everyone. Dragons passing on the outer road began to slow down when they walked by Gary's property. Not stopping. Just glancing over the low stone wall at the human and the tiny hatchling moving through the herb garden together. A few of the younger dragons sat on the cliff edge in the evenings where they had a clear view of Gary's house and watched with great curiosity. Zara heard about it too. She said nothing. But those who knew her said she had a particular stillness about her whenever Pip was mentioned. The kind of stillness that meant she was quietly pleased about something. Gary noticed the watching. He did not acknowledge it. He just went about his garden and his cooking and his reading and his careful Pip-adjusted routine, and if dragons wanted to observe that then they were welcome to observe it. One evening near the end of the 2nd week Gary was sitting outside in his chair as the sun went down. Pip was on his feet as usual. Gary had a book open in his lap but he was not reading it. He was watching the light change on the cliff face, the way it went from gold to orange to a deep flat gray. Pip made a sound. Very small. A low, soft rumble that Gary had not heard before. Not quite a purr. More like a single slow note, held for a moment and then released. Gary looked down. Pip's eyes were half closed. It was not asleep yet. It was just comfortable. Gary looked back at the cliff. He told himself again quietly that this was all temporary. But his hand had moved without him noticing, and his fingers were resting lightly on top of Pip's small folded wings. He left them there. It happened on a Tuesday. Gary did not know why he remembered that detail. Tuesdays meant nothing to him anymore. Days of the week had stopped mattering when he left the army. But afterward, when he thought about that afternoon, the first thing that came to him was always that it was a Tuesday, and the mint needed trimming, and Pip had been chasing a beetle along the garden wall. It had been a good morning. Cool and clear, with a light wind coming off the cliff that carried the smell of pine from somewhere higher up. Gary had been working in the garden since breakfast. Pip had been doing what Pip usually did, which was wander within a certain distance of Gary and investigate small things. A pebble. A slow worm moving through the soil. The beetle, which had been giving Pip a great deal of entertainment for the better part of an hour. Gary had his back turned when he heard it. A sharp crack of sound. A hiss. Then a sound from Pip that Gary had never heard before and did not want to hear again. High and short and startled, the sound of something small that had been hurt without warning. Gary turned around before the sound had finished. The animal was large. A wild hill prowler, the kind that came down from the upper ridges when they were hungry. It was lean and gray with a long jaw, and it had Pip pinned against the base of the garden wall with one heavy paw. Pip was struggling, wings beating hard against the dirt, making that sound again. Gary was already moving. He did not think about it. There was no thinking. 20 years of the army lived in his body like a second skeleton, and it took over completely. He crossed the garden in 4 steps, grabbed the nearest thing his hand found, which was the long wooden handle of his digging spade, and he swung it hard. The prowler released Pip and turned on Gary instead. Gary did not give it the chance to do anything with that turn. He was not a young man, but he was not a soft one either. He moved like someone who had spent 2 decades learning exactly where to be and exactly what to do when something dangerous was in front of him. The prowler took 2 more hits and decided Gary was not worth the trouble. It scrambled back over the garden wall and disappeared up the slope toward the ridge. Gary stood there for a moment, breathing hard, spade still in his hand. Then he dropped it and went straight to Pip. Pip was pressed against the base of the wall, wings tight against its body, scales trembling in a way Gary had not seen before. Its amber eyes were wide and fixed on Gary as he crossed the last few steps and dropped to his knees in the dirt beside it. "Easy," Gary said. His voice was low and steady. "I am here. Easy now." He ran his hands along Pip carefully. Not fast. Slow and deliberate, the way he used to check his unit for injuries in the field. Starting at the head, moving along the neck, across the back, checking each wing separately, running a thumb along every leg. He was looking for breaks, for blood, for anything that sat wrong. Pip trembled under his hands but did not pull away. There was a long scrape along Pip's left side where the prowler's claws had caught it. Not deep. It would bruise under the scales and be sore for days, but it had not broken through. Gary checked it twice to be sure. Then he sat back on his heels and let out a long, slow breath. "You are all right," he said. "Nothing broken. You are all right." Pip looked at him. Then it crawled forward across the dirt and pressed its head against Gary's chest. Gary went very still. Pip pushed in closer, tucking its nose under the edge of Gary's jacket, its whole small body shaking with the last of the fear. Gary stayed exactly where he was, kneeling in the garden dirt, one hand coming up slowly to rest against Pip's back. He stayed there until the trembling stopped. He carried Pip inside after that. He cleaned the scrape carefully with clean water and a soft cloth and a little of the herb salve he kept for his own cuts. Pip bore all of it without complaint, watching Gary's face the whole time with those wide amber eyes. Gary worked without speaking, focused and careful, the same way he had worked on injured men in far worse situations than this. When it was done, he sat in his chair by the fireplace and Pip climbed into his lap. Not his feet. His lap. Gary looked down at it. Pip looked up at him. Then Pip turned carefully, settled its chin against Gary's chest and closed its eyes. Gary sat without moving for a long time. The fire burned low. The room went quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the herb garden, and somewhere up on the cliff a night bird called once and then went silent. Gary looked down at the small creature sleeping against his chest. He thought about the prowler and how fast he had moved. He thought about Pip's voice, that short, sharp, frightened sound, and what it had done to him from 20 feet away. He was not a man who said things out loud that he was not ready to say. He had learned that silence was sometimes the most honest thing. So he did not say anything now. But he sat there in the quiet with Pip's small warm weight against his chest, and he understood something. It moved through him slowly, the way deep things do, settling into place like a stone finding the bottom of still water. He understood it completely. He just could not say it yet. 3 months passed the way good things sometimes do. Quietly, and before Gary noticed, Pip had grown. Not dramatically, not the way the other hatchlings in Thornwall had grown, shooting up in size every few weeks until they were too big for indoor spaces. Pip grew slowly, steadily, the way a plant grows when the soil is right and the water is consistent and nobody is rushing it. By the end of the 3rd month, Pip was the size of a medium dog, with scales that had deepened from pale gray to a soft blue that caught the light differently depending on the time of day. In the morning it looked silver. In the evening it looked almost violet. Gary had stopped telling himself it was temporary sometime in the second month. He could not remember the exact day. It had not been a moment of decision. It had just quietly stopped being something he said, the way a habit fades when you are not watching it. Life had reorganized itself around Pip completely and Gary had let it. There was a second bowl beside the water pump now. Pip's bowl. Gary refilled it every morning without thinking about it, the same way he refilled his own cup. There was a worn path in the floorboards between Gary's bedroom and the fireplace that had always been there, but now there was a second set of marks beside it, small and evenly spaced, claw marks pressed lightly into the old wood from 3 months of the same route walked every single day. Pip still slept against Gary's chest most nights. Not always. Some nights it chose his feet again for reasons Gary had stopped trying to understand. But most nights it was the chest, tucked under the edge of the blanket with its chin resting on Gary's collarbone and its slow warm breath against his neck. Gary slept better than he had in years. He did not examine that too closely. It was Sarah who came to the house on a morning in late autumn. Gary saw her coming up the road from the settlement and went to open the gate. He had not spoken to her since that first day in the courtyard. She walked slowly, the way very old things move, with a weight and a patience that made the ground feel more solid around her. Pip was at Gary's feet when Sarah stopped outside the gate. Pip looked up at her. Sarah looked down at Pip. Something passed between them that Gary could not name. Sarah looked at Gary. "May I come in?" she said. Gary stepped back and held the gate open. They sat in the garden, Gary on his wooden chair and Sarah settled on the wide flat ground near the fence, her great head at a level that meant she and Gary could speak without either of them straining. Pip sat on Gary's feet and watched Sarah with calm, curious eyes. "The elders have spoken," Sarah said. "About you. About the small one." Gary waited. "What has formed between you is recognized," she said. "Formally. Among our kind this bond has a name. It does not happen often. A hatchling choosing outside its own kind is rare. A hatchling choosing correctly is rarer still." She paused. "We believe Pip chose correctly." Gary looked down at Pip. Pip was watching a leaf move across the garden path. "I want to tell you something," Sarah continued. "About what the small one did and why." Gary looked back at her. "When a hatchling loses its mother before it is bonded," Sarah said slowly, "it does not grieve the way older creatures do. It does not understand loss yet. It only understands absence. A space where safety used to be." She let that sit for a moment. "So it searches. Not with thought. With something much older than thought. It moves toward whatever carries the feeling it is looking for. Warmth. Steadiness. The particular kind of stillness that exists in someone who has seen hard things and come through them." The wind moved through the herb garden. The rosemary bent and straightened. "Pip did not follow you by chance," Sarah said. "It found what it was looking for." Gary was quiet for a long moment. "I was not looking to be found," he said. "No," Sarah agreed. "That is usually how it works." She did not stay long after that. She said what she had come to say and then she rose and walked back down the road toward the settlement with that slow, enormous patience. Gary watched her go from the gate. Then he went back to his chair and sat down. Pip climbed onto his feet immediately, turned its small circle and settled. Its scales were the soft violet color they went in the late afternoon. Its eyes drifted half-closed. Within a few minutes it was asleep, its sides rising and falling in the slow, easy rhythm that Gary knew as well now as his own breathing. Gary sat with his hands resting on the arms of the chair and looked at his garden. He thought about what Sarah had said. About absence. About the search for a place that felt safe. About instinct leading small things through the dark toward whatever steady warmth it could find. He thought about himself. 20 years of keeping other people safe. Of being the calm one, the steady one, the one who stayed functional when everything around him was falling apart. And then coming home to a quiet stone house at the edge of a dragon settlement with no one to be steady for and no idea what to do with all that steadiness. He looked down at Pip. Pip slept on, completely at peace, completely certain, in the way that only a creature feels certain when it is exactly where it is supposed to be. Gary understood it now. All the way through. The thing he had not been able to say out loud for 3 months finally had a shape he could hold. A safe place was not always 4 walls and a roof. Sometimes it was a person. A particular kind of person. One who had learned how to be still in the storm and never quite knew what to do with that gift until something small and lost came looking for it. Gary exhaled slowly. He reached down and rested his hand gently on Pip's back the way he always did. Pip made that low soft sound. That single quiet note. Gary closed his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, the word home did not feel like something that belonged to other people.